Okay, good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to this, the final lecture of the 2022 Dante Public Lecture Series, and it's been a wonderful series, and part of our thinking really for the final lecture of the series, and for the final lectures of all the other series in future years, we're going to really pay attention to something that, with regard to the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland, is very important to us, and that is up and coming scholars. Early career academics, and I'm delighted to welcome one of our very own, and that is Valentina Mele, who is an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow here at University College Cork, where she is completing her first monograph, which analyzes lyric subjectivity in the work of Guido Cavalcanti, around the notion of this kind of lyric subjectivity, and it promises to be a wonderful, wonderful book, and I can't wait to read the finished product. Valentina completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge after spending other periods of time at the universities of Warwick, Oxford and Notre Dame. She's an official member of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland, and her work mainly focuses on lyric subjectivity and the intersections between Italian, English and American literature, with particular attention also to the reception of Dante in 20th century Anglo-American poetry. That's kind of the official blurb you would give Valentina. I'd just like to add that as someone who's worked very closely with her over the last 2 years, it's been a real genuine pleasure to have Valentina work with us here at the centre, to kind of the generosity of spirit, the work that she puts into everything. She organized a conference last month on Cavalcanti, which was absolutely fabulous. And, you know, the time of her fellowship is coming to an end at the end of this academic year, and we'll be very sad to see her go, but she may not realize this yet, but she will remain a member of the Centre for Dante Studies for life. There is no leaving us, but I'm delighted that she has agreed to give this lecture, and the title is Dante and Cavalcanti, the Making of a Lyric Voice. Valentina.
Good evening, everybody. I would really like to start by saying thanks to Dara, not only for the introduction, but as he just said, my fellowship is coming to an end, and I'm really humbled to be presenting my paper this evening in this very, very great series of lectures. And so I want to thank Dara publicly for inviting me, but also as this fellowship is coming to an end, for the work we have been doing together over the past year and a half. So I will start also. I also want to thank all the other members of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. Some are online, some are here in the flesh, you cannot see them, and also other colleagues here in the department. I will start straight away, some of the reflections that I will be presenting this evening have been prompted, or let's say inspired, by an essay written by Lino Leonardi and published some years ago, in which Leonardi decided to investigate the relationship between Dante and Cavalcanti, their voices, their poetic voices, from a stylistic point of view. And he chooses to look at the two poetic voices from a perspective seeking to emphasize the rallying points rather than the elements suggesting the existence of an irretrievable fracture, so the so-called irrecuperabile rottura. Let me share the screen. Okay. Since De Roberti's commentaries on De Vita Nuova and on Cavalcanti's Rime, and thanks to the most recent edition of Cavalcanti's and Dante's works, today we know that there exists what we may label as a stylistic continuity between the works of Cavalcanti and Dante, and that, in other words, to rephrase Leonardi, there is no doubt that Dante's new style, il nuovo stile, also includes the voice of the alter ego Cavalcanti. However, hoping for a refinement of the stylistic analysis on the Dante and Cavalcanti connection, which is able to consider both the diachronic dimension and the previous and contemporary lyric production, Leonardi offered some interesting idea relating to the field of lexis. He selected a number of words, and these words had to adhere to the following criteria. So as you can see from the slide, they had to be unknown to the poetic language of the Italian lyric tradition before Cavalcanti. They had to occur both in Cavalcanti's and in Dante's Vita Nuova, and they had to be productive in the later works of Dante, up to the Commedia. Among the many examples Leonardi discusses is the presence and use of the interjection de at the beginning of the verse, which is grouped by Leonardi together with those words with no full semantic value, which nonetheless are significant for the prosodic and syntactic structure of Cavalcanti and Dante's verses. This evening, I'd like to talk about this interjection, focusing on what we might suppose, what we might hypothesize is the influence of the Cavalcantian de in Dante, and trying to understand how this interjection becomes part of Dante's poetic language. And to do so, I will analyze the context and the use of de in the Vita Nuova by comparing the occurrences we have in the Vita Nuova to the ones of the pre-Dante Italian literary tradition, and by reflecting on the presence and the semantic and pragmatic function of the interjection in the libello, and possibly we will see on its stylistic function. Looking at the functions of de, I have to make some premises. Looking at the function of de, I shall specify that from a pragmatic point of view, the use of this interjection in medieval Italian can serve to two main functions, even though, as we will see, this function can be at times difficult to identify, to separate. And I am following here the Grammatica dell'Italiano Antico that can have an expository function in those occurrences where it is used to express mostly an emotional reaction of the speaker caused by a discrepancy between the speaker's expectation and a particular event or situation. And this type of interjection mostly occur in exclamations, or the interjection can fulfill an exertative function, and therefore it can contribute to increase the strength of the elocutionary act when the interjection is used by the speaker to ask the interlocutor for an explanation with regard to an expected situation which raises incredulity, amazement, and so on. This second function, the second type of interjection, can either be associated with a question which doesn't actually express a request for information, but rather just express the mood of the speaker, or in other occurrences, it is instead possible to observe a use of the same interjection which is aimed at prompting an action. Having clarified that, so in an attempt to answer the question, we might want to first look at the de of the Vita Nuova to see what is the meaning and function, or possibly functions, of this interjection in the libello. Three are the occurrences of the de in the Vita Nuova, but one of these is found the introductory prose of the sonnet De peregrini che pensosi andate, so it's a sort of a self-quotation. The first de appears in chapter 23 in a particularly macro section of the prosimetro, this section is introduced by the previous paragraph, the 22nd, where the death of Beatrice's father is recounted. The death of Beatrice is much later, as we know. It could be said that the two chapters, 22 and 23, are connected or fanno sistema, as they sort of fulfill a prolective function, and in fact, they interrupt the praise which characterized the previous chapters, and they act as Donato Pirovano said, avvicinamento a climax to the central event of the Vita Nuova, the death of Beatrice, of course. And this break, this contrast, is indicated by the word appresso, which since chapter 7 characterizes all the chapter of mourning, and as De Roberti noticed, constitutes a formula di passaggio narrativo. So it signals sort of a break. In chapter 23, Dante, the character, is struck by a sudden and painful infermitade, so a sort of an illness, which forces him to bed, and which on the 9th day gets worse and gives rise to causes a series of hallucinations. So Dante, hallucinating with fever, thinks he hears some voices announcing the death of Beatrice, and here the text, as we will see later, uses a precise phrasing, which is particularly interesting from a Cavalcantian point of view. So I was saying that this hallucination provokes Dante's bewilderment and the vision of some visi di donne scapigliate, who first inform Dante of his imminent death. They say, tu pur morrai. Then they tell him that his death has already occurred, tu sei morto. And finally, within this apocalyptic scenario, they announce Dante the death of Beatrice. Or non sai, la tua mirabile donna è partita da questo secolo. So prompting Dante to hope for his own death. So of course, the subject of the entire chapter is mourning, even though the event to be mourned, constituting sort of the linchpin of the entire narrative, is only anticipated. And the register Dante uses in this section of the book is pietoso e lamentoso, so particularly lamenting, as discussed by Stefano Carrai, who labeled the language of this section as pietoso in an attempt to describe the stylistic and linguistic aspects of the libello, which have a strong thematic implication in support of his thesis, according to which the Vita Nuova falls within the genre of the elegy, understood, of course, according to its medieval meaning. In fact, looking at vocabulary, chapter 23 is characterized by a high frequency of word pertaining to the semantic fields of pain, tears, and death. And commenting on the prose of paragraph 23, Carrai also points out that the use of the word miseria characterizes the condition to characterize the condition of the subject is significant if one considers that, to quote Carrai, la poesia, the elegy was considered la poesia dei miseri o della miseria. So was considered the poetry of the miserable or of misery. And that, and I'm quoting, nell'età medievale tutta questa famiglia di parole risulta essere marchio inconfondibile di questo stile poetico, quasi un segnale di riconoscimento. Looking at the lyric text included in this chapter, Donna pietosa di novelle etate, we know that in this text, Dante re-elaborates upon his hallucination, the one described in the prose, and he inserted into a narrative structure. In fact, the two opening stanzas of the canzone focus on the recovery of Dante the character, who, urged by these women, announces that he wants to share his hallucination. E quando un poco confortato fui, io dissi, donne, dicerolla a voi. Let's now look at the text. Era la voce, this is the second stanza. Era la voce mia sì dolorosa e rotta sì dall'angoscia del pianto, che io solo intesi il nome del mio core. E con tutta la vista vergognosa, che era nel mio viso giunta cotanto, mi fece verso lor volgere amore. Egli era tale a veder mio colore, che faceva ragionar di morte altrui. Deh, consoliam costui. Pregava l'un l'altra umilmente e dicevano sovente: che vedes tu che non hai valore? E quando un poco confortato fui, io dissi: donne, dicerollo a voi. The interjection there here, he is pronounced by the women who assisted the character and who, moved by his pallor, voiced the intention to comfort him. They say that consoliam costui. Looking at the interjection of this stanza through thinking of the two functions I've tried to isolate and discuss earlier, it is possible to suggest that here "de" as a rather evident exhortative function, as it substantiates a prayer referred to the act of consoling Dante. And the same intention corresponds to what was similarly articulated in the prose, where we read procuriamo di consolarlo. And the direct speech of these verses imbues these lines with immediacy, emphasizing the women's desire to comfort Dante and also providing an external gaze on the suffering Dante, who in the eyes of others appears to be privo di valore, as we read in the text. So within such a context, the interjection seems to fit fully into the pitiful register mentioned above, the one discussed by Carrai, giving voice to the anguish, the suffering experienced by women in the presence of Dante, and introducing a very specific plea. The second "de" appears much later in the narrative of the Vita Nuova. In fact, it can be found at the opening of the sonnet "De peregrini che pensosi andate" on chapter 40. After the vision of Beatrice, which puts an end to the episode of the Donna Gentile, and which also marks the victory of ragione over vana tentazione, Dante finds himself observing a group of pensive pilgrims. These pilgrims are, as we know, are headed to Rome and are passing through Florence. In the sonnet of this chapter, Dante expresses the reflection stemmed from this episode. De peregrini che pensosi andate, forse di cosa che non v'è presente, venite voi da sì lontana gente, come alla vista voi ne dimostrate, che non pianger quando voi passate per lo suo mezzo la città dolente, come quelle persone che niente par intendesse la sua gravitate. Se voi restate per volerlo audire, certo lo cor dei sospiri mi dice, che lagrimando n'uscireste poi. E l'ha perduta la sua Beatrice, e le parole che on di lei può dire hanno vertù di far piangere altrui. It is Dante himself who declares his will to emphasize the pitying character of these verses. In fact, in the prose we read: onde passata costoro dalla mia veduta, proposi di fare un sonetto nel quale io manifestasse ciò che aveva detto fra me medesimo e acciò che paresse più pietoso. The opening vocative of the lyric and the emphatic interrogative, which are protracted along the entire octet, comply with Dante's intention, as the open reference to the città dolente does. And these elements also recall the central episode of mourning of the Libello, that is, of course, the loss of Beatrice, also establishing an explicit connection with chapter 23. Quoting again Carrai, he notices that the same connection is emphasized through, and I'm reading, l'eco persistente del versetto dello pseudo Geremia sul quale Dante aveva dichiaratamente costruito l'avvio "Dio voi che per la via". eccetera, eccetera, quasi a sottolineare una specularità tra il secondo e il penultimo sonetto del prosimetro. Ma più che per preoccupazione di ordine propriamente simmetrico, direi per marcare la circolarità del tema del pianto e dell'invito a partecipare al dolore del poeta. So the scriptural tone characterizing this passage and many other passages of the Vita Nuova, as many have discussed, corroborates the pitiful texture of the chapter and stress the elegiac tone. The comparison between O voi che per la via and De Peregrini is even more significant if we pay attention to the addressee of the apostrophe. So as observed by recent commentators, the lyric subject broadens his request for participation in his suffering, while O voi che per la via only addresses some bystanders. The vocative of De Peregrini is addressed to a wider, universal audience. As the introductory prose suggests, to the extent that, for example, De Robertis comments this line by talking of perdita generale and Gorni of lutto corale or lutto canonico e universale. Dante's lexical note on the term Peregrini, as Pirovano observe, rivela l'ideale di massima apertura del pubblico del suo livello. So in the light of these reflections, the use of de appears to be part of a precise stylistic choice. The function of the interjection in the Vita Nuova is here at the same time allocutive and exhortative, but the exhortation, which is expressed through a question, articulates a request for, in this last case, for universal mourning for the loss of Beatrice. As a consequence, even the semantically neutral de here takes on a plaintive connotation. Now, looking at the Italian lyric text up to the 15th century, I shall first point to the fact that the etymology of de is uncertain, but this is not really important. What is more important is that one of the hypotheses suggests looking at de as an elided form of Deo. This is quite relevant when surveying the text included in the database of the Tesoro della Lingua Italiana, because the choice of reading de rather than Deo, when so two completely different interjections, when the manuscript simply reads de, is attributable to the editor. So therefore, it might be in part arbitrary. Just to mention a couple of relevant examples, this was the case for Pier della Vigna. In fact, if you survey the Tesoro della Lingua Italiana looking for that, you see a lot of occurrences. But for example, the case of Pier della Vigna had a de, but the latest critical edition of the text reads che. So this was one example, but also one other problematic case was Monte Andrea, where the two occurrences were instead to de. It was not an interjection, as Michele Picciocco revealed in his upcoming new critical edition. So having mentioned that and looking at the slide, according to the survey, it is possible to observe that in poetry, the form de, to which modern edition generally connect a number of spellings that are listed in slide. So this form at the opening of verse occurs only rarely in pre-Dante and pre-Cavalcantian context, although we cannot say that is completely unknown to early Italian poets, as evidenced by occurrences in Guittone and in the Tesoretto. And these occurrences are of course already mentioned in the Leonardi, and some other occurrences always present in Tuscan or Tuscanized text. However, it is relevant to observe that the frequencies increases, especially in lyric text, are already at the time of Lapo Gianni, Cino, and Niccolò de Rossi. But let's focus very briefly on the occurrences in Guittone. we have this one occurrence on the last tercet of the sonnet. And I'm just going to read the last tercet. Messer Gherardo di non saver saggio, lo chiaro e scuro, bene mio convenente, de quelle sguardate che non guardo, om saggio. So in the second and concluding ending tercet of the sonnet, that is used by Guittone with a clear allocutive function here, and it is placed at the beginning of the verse to recall the vocative of line 12 and to reiterate his apostrophe. But we can see that it's pretty different from what we have seen in Dante. Looking at this data, the case of Cavalcanti is even only quantitatively rather striking. In fact, we have 8 occurrences that can be found in the rime, and this number appears all the more significant once we consider them not only in the context of the pre-Cavalcantian context, but also if we consider the smallness of Guido's poetic corpus. And it's even more remarkable the fact that 4 occurrences are focused, are concentrated in the same sonnet. De spiriti miei, quando mi vedete. Here it's a list, so we have 4 occurrences in De spiriti miei, and then other 4 occurrences in the rest of the corpus. I'm now going to focus on individual cases, paying attention to context to see if it's possible to observe a series of common elements. So sonnet 6 is De spiriti miei, quando mi vedete, con tanta pena, come non mandate fuor della mente parole adornate di pianto, dolorose e sbigottite. De, voi vedete che il core ha ferite di sguardo e di piacere ed umilitate. De, io vi prego che voi consoliate e che son da lui le sue virtù partite. Gli veggio a lui spirito apparire, alto e gentil e di tanto valore, che fa le sue virtù tutte fuggire. De, io vi prego che deggiate dire all'alma trista che parli in dolore, come ella fu e fie sempre d'amore. Okay, I'm going back to this slide, sorry. Okay, I'm reading just quickly the other occurrences that you will see them separately. We have De foresette, non mi abbiate a vile per lo colpo che io porto, questo cor mi fu morto, poi che in Tolosa fui. Then Ballata 35, we have De ballatetta, la tua amistade, etc., etc. And then again, De ballatetta, di le sospirando, quando le sei presente. And then we have Sonnet 52, where we read, De, con tu fai grandissimo peccato, si alto sangue voler discacciare, che tutti vanno via senza ritegno. So with the exception of this last occurrence of the series, which is in any case a bit problematic to compare to the rest of the lyric, as it falls under the category of rime di corrispondenza, and it's addressed to Nerone Cavalcanti. So, however, with the exception of this last De, which seems to be performing a evocative and expository function, and to be emphasizing in this case the mockery of the sonnet's addressee, all other occurrences appear to be characterized by both the exhortative and a presentative function. And in fact, I shall note that among the most striking analogies characterizing Cavalcanti's use of De is that the interjection is connected to the semantic field of prayer and lament, and that it introduces a vocative, be it addressed, as we have seen, to the spiriti, to the foresette, or to the ballatetta. And this request introduces this plea introduces a request for attention, for listening, and more importantly, for compassion. This request is particularly direct and emphatic in the case of De spiriti miei. It is addressed to bystanders as part of a peculiar historical dimension, peculiar as compared to the rest of the Cavalcantian corpus. And finally, it appears to be mediated through the written text in the so-called Ballata di Lontananza, so Ballata number 35, which, as we know, is a very famous text. It acts at the same time as the privileged interlocutor of the subject and also as a means for reaching the beloved lady. It will be worth noting that paying attention to the context, that the two functions of that I just indicated above are emphasized by these lexical elements that you can see in the slides, that again can be traced back to the semantic field of pain, crying, and lament. So I'm not going to read the whole list, but as you can see, we have pena, pianto, dolorose, sbigottite, trista, dolore, pietosa, pietate, etc., etc. And I would like to stress another aspect which might support the thesis according to which the Cavalcantian de is part of a precise, pitiful vocabulary. In fact, the request for commiseration, the Cavalcantian subject actors, as observed by many scholars, and more recently by Roberto Rea, among the many, this request is articulated through the internalization of two passages from the Lamentations, which is a source that, and I'm quoting De Robertis, percorre tutto il dolente discorso cavalcantiano e costituisce la prospettiva fissa della richiesta di attenzione e di partecipazione. The request of the lyric subject, Rea observes, is generally claimed in the name of a pain that is objectively visible to the eyes of others, and therefore this request often includes the use of verba videndi and verba dicendi in cases where not only the subject asks others to recognize his pain, to see his pain, but also he utters a plea so that these bystanders verbalize the pain of the subject. This way also somehow seeking to escape from the boundaries of his inner dimension. In De Spiriti Miei, this same request possibly reaches one of the highest degrees of self-referentiality, since it is addressed by the subject to his own spirit. So in the iterated allocution that we have seen, that occurs repeatedly as in a litany to amplify, even mimetically, if one interprets that as an expression of anguish and perhaps as a symptom of the acceleration of the pneumatic circulation, so to amplify the intensity and the urgency of the plea. So if, as we have seen, that can express the mood of the speaker and or substantiate a request, these were the two main functions, the use of the in Cavalcanti, at least in most of the cases we have seen, seems to belong to a specific subcategory, as it generally introduces a vocative and a prayer, a request for attention, which is pronounced by a suffering subject. And the high frequency of occurrences suggest including in such a small corpus, suggest including the interjection among the words composing Cavalcanti's vocabulary of pain. In the light of what we have just seen, I shall now propose a number of considerations regarding Dante's use of that in the Vita Nuova. So even the quantitative analysis alone make it difficult to suppose Dante's naive use of the interjection, especially as it is used so frequently by a poet as close to Dante as Cavalcanti was. The analysis of the context has also highlighted that in both poets, the interjection occurs in context associated with the semantic of, as we said, pain, tears, anguish, and so on, suggesting that the de, at the time of the Vita Nuova, has a particular lamenting expressiveness. It shall also be noted that in the first of the two occurrences of the libello, references to Cavalcanti, and I'm moving slide, are also established thematically and through a constellation of lexical intertexts, which will, as we will see, lie at the crossroad between lexis, syntax, and meter. First of all, as we can read in the slide, I shall mention the combined use of the verbs convenire and morire, which has been listed by Maria Corti among the many stylistic elements characterizing the speeches of personified amore in Cavalcanti's rime. So we have convenire and morire occurring in the prose introducing the canzone Donna pietosa e di novella etate. And Dante's use of the formula is particularly relevant as it does not occur in the pre-Cavalcantian lyric again, while in Cavalcanti's rime occurs repeatedly. Focusing again on the stanza of Donna Pietosa, I shall also mention that Dante's representation of the suffering Io, on line 26, che vedes tu che tu non hai valore, makes use of a praising that again references Cavalcanti Sonnet 7, l'anima mia civilmente sbigottita, here quoted in the slide, where the subject soul, his anima, is said to be sta come quella che non ha valore. And finally, and here again I shall quote Leonardi, the use of the pronoun costui as a rhyme is inedito nella tradizione duecentesca prima di Cavalcanti, and so it's particularly significant as in Guido's corpus 3 out of 4 occurrences in 3 out of 4 occurrences costui è il poeta, è oggetto di distruzione e morte in quanto additato a esempio. This was a direct quote. So while for the first of the Vita Nuova, the connection with Cavalcanti is established thematically and through this constellation of Cavalcantian references, in the Peregrini, the intertextual connection with Cavalcanti, which was already noticed by Gorni, is even more open, I'd say, for the interjection, including the vocative and the long interrogative, reminds the sonnet De Spiriti Miei, especially from the syntactic point of view. However, we shall also point to the fact that compared to Cavalcanti's sonnet, in the Peregrini, as we just said, the recipient of the request for attention is no longer the subject, but rather a wider audience, and that the prayer introduced by the interjection invokes the sharing of a universal suffering. I'm about to conclude, but I just say that the occurrences of in the rime appears to support the hypothesis of the congruità stilistica, a connection between the stylistic function of Cavalcanti's and of Dante's interjection at the time of the Vita Nuova. And these occurrences, one might suppose, must have influenced the later, or let's say the still novistic use of that, which occur with different functions, for example, as we said, in Lapo and Cino. Although, as we know, the chronology of the rime is problematic and is uncertain, it's significant that all texts in which the 5 occurrences of the outside of the Vita Nuova appear are characterized by strong thematic connection with the libello, or even by intertextual references to Cavalcanti's corpus. The first text I want to look at is the Balata Bevioletta, che in ombra d'amore, which is probably to be attributable to the early Dante, and therefore it can be considered chronologically close to the Vita Nuova. This Balata has 2 occurrences of the interjection, as we will see in the slide. And this interjection introduces a vocative and a request for mercy. Then the second text is Onde venite voi così pensose, where the request of the lyric subject, De gentil donne non siate sdegnose, on line 5, is addressed to some women who are pensose, again as the peregrini. And the plea also echoes Cavalcanti's ballata Era in pensier d'amor quando io trovai, and specifically line 9, where we read De foresette non mi abbiate a vile. And the same request is formulated together with a request to recognize the pain of the subject. Two more texts very quickly. Then we have Voi donne che pietose atto mostrare, a sonnet which it has been noted on the one hand is connected with Onde venite, even though, as Marco Grimaldi pointed out, the chronology of the two texts is problematic, and on the other hand is thematically connected with chapter 22 of the Vita Nuova again. The inclusion of de in the vocative clause again contributes to the articulation of a request, although here the addressees are not pleased to listen, but rather the subject urges this interlocutor to confirm the identity of the woman who lies suffering. But here again, we can see that the request is formulated within a semantic of anguish. And finally, to conclude, in Dai ragioniamo insieme un poco amore, the suffering io, who says e tra mi di ira che mi fa pensare, apostrophizes personified amore, asking for a dialogue. So looking again at all these occurrences, if we assume that Dante's De depends on Cavalcanti, I suggest looking at Dante's interjection as being characterized by slightly greater lexical and semantic intensity than that assigned by Leonardi. So while the general semantic of the interjection makes difficult to describe the connection between Cavalcanti's and Dante as an example of memoria allusiva, the specific lamentatory expressiveness suggests looking at these occurrences as consciously Cavalcantian, and of course here chronology is crucial, and at Dante's reuse as going beyond the simple reuse of serbatoio stilistico as Leonardi labeled it, but rather again as a conscious reuse of a young Dante, perhaps looking for his lyric voice. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Valentina. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen there, if you don't mind. Come over here. You can. So I'm sure we already have. So as we've done in the past, if you just put up your hand for questions. But before we kind of bring it, let it go to the public, I just want to ask essentially about these interjections. About if we move forward into the commedia and interjections in the commedia. Are they? Is there still this Cavalcantian influence?
Shall I move there?
Yeah,
okay. Okay. Thanks for the question, Dara. Because actually, when surveying, I of course noticed that there were many occurrences of that in the commedia, but let's say that is often used. When seeking for the attention of a speaker, of a character, so it doesn't really. It's more like let's say a modulo del parlato, something connected to speech, than a formula like an interjection which carries this semantic of pain and suffering.
Okay, thank you. So, do we have any questions? Anyone got their hand up there? And of course, people in the room are allowed to ask questions as well. Anyone with any questions? Leila, do you want to come up, because people won't hear you if you don't speak into the microphone here. So, Leila Livraghi with our first question.
Hello. Thank you, Valentina, for your lecture. I was very interested, especially for the relationship between Dante and Cavalcanti and the beginning of our national literature, and also for the image of these first poets in the production of the later poets. You said something about Cino, for example, and I'm interested in your opinion. Do you think that Cino's use of the de and other like linguistic or stylistic modules from Cavalcanti and from Dante can be interpreted as the fact that Cino, as other poets, the same Petrarch, and also like in the Raccolta Aragonese, for example, they didn't think that there was like a rupture or a contraposition between Cavalcanti and Dante, while it was like Dante that wanted to underline this like very strong contraposition between himself and Cavalcanti. At least, yeah, I see that you don't seem very convinced about what I'm saying. So please tell me your opinion.
No, I'm not sure that you understood what you said. Like basically, that looking at that, you were saying that perhaps there is no rupture.
Yes, and also I studied Cino, for example, and he takes linguistic features both from Dante and Cavalcanti. It's more complicated than that, but I think that Dante was the most interested in underlying a contraposition between himself and Cavalcanti, and that there is like continuity in style and language, and as you showed for the death, for example.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for the question. So the later occurrences of the day after Dante are interesting in the sense that they are not necessarily Cavalcantian. So it's much more diversified. Well, there is nothing, well, pretty much nothing before Cavalcanti, then there is Cavalcanti, and then we can see that in the Vita Nuova Dante sort of, even if we accept chronology, etc., Dante is sort of referencing Cavalcanti somehow, and there is still a Cavalcantian influence in the Rime, while later there is like all the examples of that are not, as I said, necessarily Cavalcantian. So perhaps, yes, perhaps there is no such a rupture. There is no the how can I say, that is not perceived as something necessarily either Cavalcantian or Dantean. So in this case, yes, I'd say I agree. So
yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
So by that stage, it's going to be subsumed into a general thing too.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can go with dice. But I wanted to ask a personal question. But
Okay, we'll just go with. We have a question here from a David Bow. Could you comment further on the Cavalcantian resonance of Dante's calls to have a suffering witness, or recollections of it being witnessed in the passages in the Vita Nuova you cited?
okay.
So,
okay, so
the resonance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the Cavalcantian subject is always suffering, as we know, but it's not just suffering. Is asking other people to prove basically that he's suffering. And can you hear me? I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I basically he always needs some bystanders, or he please bystanders to prove to, or also to provide the reader with an outer perspective on what is going on. So this is what often we see in the Rime. In the two examples in the example of the Vita Nuova that I have quoted, there was this, I found striking that there was the same sort of dynamic within a context of mourning, of suffering, and within a, as I said, a lexical constellation of Cavalcantian words. So in this case, and I hope I answered the question, I think that this thematic element, or this sort of dynamic, is relevant to understand, maybe, or to read, to interpret the De within the context Dante is using it.
Okay, so we have three questions. So first we're going to have Dario's question, then Chris, and then Kenneth. Dario, you go first.
Can I stay here? Do I have?
Let's just go around.
There people see your face.
It's a nice
Hi.
place.
Okay, thank you, Valentina, for your brilliant talk. I wanted to ask two questions. One is more general, and the other one maybe is quite stupid. Let's start with the stupid one. Is the De just like a poetic, specifically poetic interjection, or okay?
Okay, no, in the sense that it only occurs in lyric. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, do you think it was? Can we guess a sort of use even in like normal conversations? In that context, in the context of suffering, do you think it was used even in, or is it just poetic?
Well, it occurs a lot in prose,
Okay.
but not necessarily in this context. That's why I think it's pretty much Cavalcantian, used within this, like within an apostrophe, within a request, etc. But no, it's not.
It's not just lyrical.
No,
okay.
it's definitely pertains to a specific geographic area.
Okay.
So Tuscan and Tuscanized text, but not just in the lyric.
Okay. And the other one is more generic. If you can provide us with, I don't know if you've studied them, but if you can provide us with other interjections in the Vita Nuova, if there are some particular examples that you want to focus.
Yes, thank you. So, of course, there is not the only interjection used in the Vita Nuova. And one other interesting case is, for example, the use of O and OI, which was studied recently by Lucia Bartolini, who a few years ago published an essay basically saying that there is a difference between O and OI, and so there would be a very long philological discussion. But what I find interesting is that she included, again, this interjection within this plaintive register because this interjection occur in specific areas of the Vita Nuova. And then, of course, there is the usual Deo or Lasso. Lasso, again, is very connected to mourning, again, while Deo is more like an expression. But yeah, it's the situation in the Vita Nuova is pretty much diversified, with some areas where this interjection seems to be charged with a specific semantic, even though, except for the case of Deo and Lasso, they have no full semantic value normally.
Okay, Chris, is that a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Valentina. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. One thought that I had was that one of the later uses of De occurs in Canto 10 of the Inferno, where Dante, where the pilgrim refers it to Farinata. But in Dante, of course, proximity is always important. And obviously we had Cavalcanti de Cavalcanti, who was just dismissed, just fell back into the tomb, as it were. And since we know that, or we believe that, of course, Dante's use of dolce lume, dolce lome, strikes a responsive chord with the poetry of Cavalcanti. And so I was wondering if this use of De can fit into some sort of pattern in terms of the influence of Cavalcanti on Dante.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for your question, and also for bringing up this this very curious, let's say, very curious occurrence of the De. Well, I think, as I said earlier, that the De in the Commedia has a quite different function, but I agree with you that it's really striking that it occurs in a canto where the presence of Cavalcanti is so much, let's say, anamorphically evoked as in this canto. So I'd like to perhaps look better at the Commedia, something that I haven't really done so far. But this definitely, when I was looking at the occurrences, this definitely I found it very interesting, very curious, because of course there are many occurrences, but this one is in a very particular place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Kenneth.
Thanks very much, Dara. Thanks very much, Valentina. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. And really picking up maybe from Christopher's question about the use of de in the Commedia. It is interesting. It's striking enough. It's not overused in the comedy. There are only 13 examples of de in the comedy, and 8 of them, a full 8 of them, appear in the Purgatory. So there's a kind of purgatorial quality about de. There's something going on there, and exactly half of those occurrences, 4, appear in Canto 5 of Purgatory. So there is, I think it's not sort of casual, or it's not sort of random. I think there is something going on in terms of the of perhaps a kind of a shifting of that Stile Novist expression of pity or expression of compassion has been sort of transformed into something different by the time it gets into Purgatory. And I think that the shifting use of de signals that. But my question was really, I was very struck by the uses of de in the Cavalcanti example that you gave, and in particular poem Sonnet 6, but it was a feature of a lot of them that it seemed to fall on rather non-neutral lines. So line 1, line 5, marking sort of the partitions of the compositions, marking the partitions of the sonnet, often perhaps the congedo, or so. I suppose my question is how de can be connected with rhetoric and the rhetorical kind of patterning in the poems, and the way in which it's used to mark and demarcate the rhetorical parts of the sonnet.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for your question. It's interesting that the same thing that Cavalcanti does with the de, for example, I'm looking at the screen, it's very confusing. What Cavalcanti does with the de, as you notice at the beginning of the verse, and then with this anaphora sort of reiterating the apostrophe, also happens, for example, in one very striking case, which is the Balata di Lontananza, where we rather than there we have two. So I'd say that perhaps these keywords are used by Cavalcanti in this case, in both cases, to emphasize the self-referentiality of his request, because in the first case is apostrophing the spirit, his own spirit. In the second case is apostrophing the ballata, which is sort of the reification of the poetic word, and it's basically the interlocutor of the subject and also the mediator between the subject and the woman. So it definitely has, I'd say, a rhetoric function, but I'd inscribe it within other other keywords that Cavalcanti uses within his corpus.
Okay. Thank you, Valentina. So that's it really, folks. Now, before we go, I want to thank a number of people and a number of bodies. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues in the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland for their sterling work and their kind of indefatigable energy. We have two important events coming up in March. Firstly, I just want to let you know about on Monday, the 14th of March, we'll be launching this wonderful volume, if you can see it there. This is by our very own Federico Colucci. This is Dante Beyond Influence, Rethinking Reception in Victorian Literary Culture. And that was published by Manchester University Press. Federica, as you know, was one of our IRC postdoctoral fellows here at UCC when completing the volume. So we are truly delighted. She'll be coming over to us from Warwick, and Professor Nick Havely will launch the book for us. Now, later in March, on the 28th of March, we should we're going to begin our new series called Dante Futures, and the interlocutors on that occasion will be Matteo Maselli from the University of Macerata, Valentina Iosco from Siena, and Katie Basterman from Oxford. And this has all been organized, and this will be mediated by our own Dario Galassini. And this is the first of what we hope will be a series of events looking at the future of Dante studies from a variety, a kaleidoscope of different perspectives and outlooks. So I'm very excited about that. And that is very much the brainchild of the younger members of the centre. So that's it. I'm so happy. I'm so relieved. Not only did we have a wonderful evening this evening, but I'm just so relieved we didn't get Zoom bombed by the Petarchisti like we did last week. And that's a stress. So and I'm so happy that we were able to finish on such a high note with a wonderful lecture by Valentina. So again, thanks to my colleagues in the CDSI, but also thanks to all my colleagues and friends in the Department of Italian, and a shout out to Marco Amici, who designs our annual poster for us and who's here in the room physically today. Also all of our colleagues in the centre, or sorry, in the School of Languages and Catholic as well, and those other colleagues who are big followers of our series. I'd like especially to thank our 5 speakers from the series this year. That is Christina Olsen, Catherine Adoyo, Ted Caci, John Barnes, and Valentina Mele. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that we were treated to something very, very special this year with these lectures. So thank you all. And lastly, I'd like to thank you, our wonderful audience, for your encouragement, your perseverance, and your solidarity. We look forward to welcoming you all back next year in the same period of time. And we've already started making plans for next year's series, so we'll let you know about that in due course. In the meantime, please take care, please stay safe. Hopefully this time next year it'll be a much more peaceful world. So thanks a lot. Cheers.
Dara, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
Yeah, sorry, I can't be seen. There's something wrong with the phone. Doesn't matter. May I please say thank you as an addict to the Dante series? I think it's just been wonderful that despite everything, we're carrying on. You are carrying on, leading the flag, and we are all with you. So I think it's just wonderful. There've been 5 very different lectures, all very, very interesting and stimulating. And just thank you. Thank you as an ordinary, very devoted listener.
Thank you.
Until next time again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Grazie.